Ever look at the real estate section in the Sunday New York Times? But if you don't, you're missing something, because it's really, really interesting. A lot more interesting than you might think. Because not only does that section have all kinds of information about New York City today, including profiles of various neighborhoods that even if you know the city pretty well, you may never have even heard of, but there's a lot of historical information included too. Information about buildings and places that have long since disappeared and the stories behind them. It's really interesting. And I'd love to see something like that in the Inquirer on a regular basis too, including the same kind of vignettes about all the little neighborhoods that make up the city of Philadelphia. But one of the regular features in this real estate section is one that appears every Sunday on page 2, an article called Big Ticket. It contains a description of the most expensive residential sale of the preceding week. Well, you only imagine what that looks like in New York City these days. And it gives you a real snapshot of how not the other half, but the other fabled 1% lives. And it was there a couple of weeks ago that I saw the article, a small excerpt of which I have printed on your bulletin cover this morning, a rather unusual bulletin cover, I must admit. But it wasn't the amount of the transaction that caught my eye, because this particular apartment cost a mere $23 million, which is nothing particularly special by the standards of the big ticket, where apartments these days may go for as much as $100 million. Nor was it the fact that the individual who apparently purchased this particular apartment already owns numerous other homes in New York, some of them worth considerably more even than this one. I must say, though, that it does make for an interesting contemporary variant on the parable of the bigger barns that Jesus told in our gospel lesson this morning. Nowadays, we don't always tear down our older barns to build bigger ones. Nowadays, we just buy more barns and more and still more. But that's not what caught my eye either. No, what got my attention about this article was the fact that the purchaser of this particular apartment was an individual by the name of Stephen A. Cohen, a name that has been much in the news of late. You see, Cohen is the head of a hedge fund that is called SAC Capital Advisors. SAC standing, of course, for Stephen A. Cohen. He founded this firm about 20 years ago now, and it has been enormously successful over that time, in the process providing Mr. Cohen with a personal fortune far beyond anything of which any of us have even the remotest conception. And the famous phrase coined by the novelist Tom Wolfe some years ago in Bonfire of the Vanities, Cohen is one of the masters of the universe, one of those rich on a scale of which you and I know nothing. However, it was not the phenomenal success of his firm that was the subject of so much recent news, but rather the fact that SAC Capital Advisors, this hugely profitable hedge fund, has now been indicted for criminal conduct, specifically for the systematic and pervasive violation of laws prohibiting insider trading. It's the first major American company to be indicted on such serious criminal grounds since the Enron scandal some 10 years ago. Now, I realize that the firm has only been indicted, and it has not yet been convicted of anything at all. And it is certainly due the same presumption of innocence that we would grant to any individual charged with a crime. But the fact remains that numerous individuals that do work for this firm have either already pled guilty or have been convicted of criminal insider trading. which can't help but lead one to believe that where there's that much smoke, there has to be at least some fire. Which then raises the question that I'd like for us all to reflect upon today, and that is, why? Why would anyone or any organization that has already proved that they are extraordinarily good at what they do, so good that they are literally among the very best at it in the world, why would they, of all people, resort to cheating? Why would anyone who's already demonstrated that he or she can earn not just millions, but billions of dollars legally, at some point decide to break the law and thereby risk losing not only a considerable part of that fortune, but even risk going to jail? And break the law not to feed your family, nor buy shoes for your children or provide health care for your enfeebled parents. No. To break the law in order simply to make even more billions. Why? Now, of course, this is not just a question for hedge fund masters of the universe. It's a question these days that applies just as well to certain baseball players, one in particular. Another person much in the news here lately, like Stephen A. Cohen, another individual who has long since demonstrated that he is among the very best ever to have played the game of baseball. So why, at some point in the last 10 or so years, did Alex Rodriguez decide to start cheating? To start using banned substances, the so-called performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs. Why? The answer, it would seem, is that at some point, accumulating more, whether it's more billions of dollars in profits, or more home runs, or more whatever, simply accumulating more, becomes, for some of us, not just one of our goals in life, but the only goal. The only thing in life that matters anymore. Now, that this does happen is painfully obvious, but why it should happen is not. Why would anyone do that? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure any of you is capable, every bit as much as I am, of answering it. But I would like to think about that question this morning by reflecting upon the actions of another group of people who did not do it, who in fact did the exact opposite and went to considerable lengths to do just the exact opposite. You see, the activities of SAC Capital Advisors, as well as the actions of a number of other such firms, is more than a little reminiscent of the famous successes of an earlier era in American history, that period that was christened by Mark Twain the Gilded Age. Also a time of enormous economic expansion, then triggered by the Civil War and its aftermath, and like the past few years, a period notable for the accumulation of vast personal fortunes, though in absolute terms, the money involved then was nothing compared to the kinds of dollars we're talking about today. But again, like today, the tycoons that are associated with the Gilded Age, the names of which are still famous today, names like Vanderbilt, Gould, Stanford, Rockefeller, and so on, were all widely suspected in their day of playing fast and loose with the rules. Though to my knowledge, none of them was ever convicted of anything, in large part, though, because the laws prohibiting certain activities were written after the fact, written, in fact, because of those gentlemen. However similar the two eras, though, there is one big difference between the Gilded Age of the late 19th century and the Gilded Age of which we live today, in which we live today. And that difference is one that I have never, ever seen anyone comment on, but I think it is undoubtedly true. And that is the fact that while the church in America was a significant beneficiary of the fortunes generated during the Gilded Age, that has not been the case more recently. Now, certainly many institutions in our society have benefited greatly from the extraordinary increase in personal wealth that has taken place at the very top of the economic ladder in our times, colleges and universities in particular, but not, for the most part, the church. But before you lament that turn of events, before you wish that more of those funds had found their way into the church's coffers, and if not into the church at large's coffers, certainly into our church's coffers, I would ask you to consider what the effect of all that generosity was upon the church in that earlier day. I think it's important to do that before you begin to wish for more of it today. Now, perhaps the most obvious example of how the church benefited from the post-war, that is, post-Civil War economic prosperity, is one that is literally all around you at the moment, and that, of course, is this building. Any of you ever noticed the difference between this building and all the other buildings that First and Second churches had occupied prior to this one? Those buildings no longer exist, of course, but there are pictures of all of them running down the hall and in the library. And if you take a look, you can see immediately that none of them comes close to being as grand as the building in which you are now sitting. In fact, there is literally no comparison between church buildings that were built before and after the Civil War. And that's pretty much true throughout the country, though most of all, of course, in the North for rather obvious reasons. And if you see then a very large and very grand church here in Philadelphia, you can almost be certain that it was built at some point between 1870 and 1910. They are the churches of the Gilded Age. And there are a lot of them, quite a lot of them here in Philadelphia that fall into that category, every one of which is now struggling with the cost of maintaining and preserving these treasures. And most with nowhere near the success that thus far, at least, we've been able to achieve here. In fact, quite a number of the buildings built during that era are in the process right now of falling down. Such buildings were no doubt a blessing. And for us here, they are still a blessing. But it is a decidedly mixed blessing, to be sure. Now, that influence of the Gilded Age upon the church is very obvious. It's literally right in front of our eyes. But another important development that took place in the American church during those years is less clearly the fruit of the Gilded Age, and that is the great missionary movement of the late 19th century. In fact, I have never seen any account of that movement, which was without question the greatest and most expansive missionary effort in the long history of the Christian church. I've never seen any account of that movement that ties it in any way to the Gilded Age and to the influence of those years upon the church. But I think it was very clearly a factor, though perhaps not in the way that you might initially think. Because it was not only that the church was flush with money during those years and could suddenly then afford to send more and more missionaries overseas, though that may in fact have been the case, nor was it, as has been very often suggested, that the church was flush with confidence following the war and newly determined to conquer the entire world for Christ, thereby working hand in hand with the great powers that during the late 19th century colonialized a great deal of the undeveloped world, especially in Africa and Asia, though again, that too may have been the case. And it is certainly one often invoked by historians who are often quite cynical of the church and its motivations. But what almost no one ever stops to think, and I have literally never heard anyone say this, is that there may well have been a further motivation. For many of those missionaries who chose to go overseas during those years, many of whom, in fact, the majority of whom were women, and many of whom never returned home to stay. And I think that motivation for many of those people may actually have been disgust. Disgust at what the accumulation of so much money was doing to the church and to our society, and a desire on their part to escape its corrupting influence by going to places where Christianity maintained a much simpler and, in their eyes, much purer presence. The Puritans in the 1620s who decided to leave England and come to America called their move making haste out of Babylon. Making haste out of Babylon. And I suggest the same may well have been true of the missionaries who went out into the world during the late 19th century, who went out into the world seeking to follow Paul's admonition to seek the things that are above where Christ is, instead of staying home and building ever bigger barns to hold their ever-increasing worldly possessions. They were making haste out of Babylon to escape a society that was more and more given over simply to bigger barns. But their actions speak to us today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor now and forevermore.